Well, welcome to the Deontology Part 2. It's Chapter 12. We're looking at Kantian perspective about autonomy and respect. Pop. This is just a short kind of a review, but I want to remind you that these duties are prescriptive categories of Kant's ideas. They're prohibitions and obligations. So prohibitions are those that you shouldn't do. Don't do that. And obligations are those that you should do, that you're totally required. Those are prescriptive. The last P happens to be the permissions. This is where in life we do most of our stuff. You have permission to eat lunch whenever you want to or go without. You're not obligated to, you're not prohibited to, and you can live where you want, do the job you want, those kinds of things. They are not moral activities necessarily. But in moral behavior and the idea of this class, we're looking in these normative theories that the obligations and prohibitions are prescriptive duties that Kant recognizes, but he sees them also with the permissions that we live in. Okay, he lived in the 1700s, died in early 1800s, which is the turn of the 19th century. Foremost deontologist. He is the one we're looking for deontology. Focused on fairness, consistency, justice, and integrity. In this chapter, we're looking at autonomy and respect are a part of that. The hypothetical and categorical imperatives he talks about, and the universalizability of maxims. Absolutes are not a thing, as he said in the last chapter, because, hey, they might contradict and therefore it just does bad things. He doesn't talk about absolutes so much. While absolutes may not be a thing for him, he does have these categorical imperatives that are, he feels, very important, and they turn into maxims. And one of the maxims that a lot of people might have is that slavery is wrong. You shall not be having slaves. You shall not have slavery. But this Richard Hare presents an argument. He promoted the idea that slavery is not evil, and in fact that it promotes the greatest good for the most people. So it's a great utilitarian concept in this idea of theories of morality or ethical theory. Slavery, he suggests, is not intrinsically wrong. And I would agree with him in this. Slavery is not wrong when you look at the full history of what slavery is about. If you strictly look only at American slavery in the 16, 17, 1800s, as we are taught about in American history, what the Civil War was largely about, that kind of slavery is wrong. I would say it's intrinsically wrong because it's based purely on the color of skin. But biblical slavery, from the Jewish perspective, from the Christian perspective, even from a Roman perspective, and a lot of people would see and recognize that slavery wasn't all that bad. It was nothing more than what you would, they would call them indentured servants, but they were hired workers in a sense. You owned them. You could tell them no. You could make them do things. But slaves back in the day of biblical times had options. They had rights. They had property. And they themselves could own slaves. Just to point out that not all slavery is the same. So you need to make sure you understand the definition of the term slavery. Kant would disagree about it being not intrinsically politically wrong because he was looking at especially the American and the European slavery at the time, felt that it didn't treat people with dignity or respect. And I would agree with that. Slavery at that time didn't. But there are boundaries for slavery in other areas that do show dignity and respect. And that's not what the class is about, but I just want to highlight that. American slavery is unique in the terms of what slavery is in the history of the world. Richard Hare wanted to present this idea. He didn't go into the biblical concepts or the historical concepts, but he used World War II history and promoted this idea. And it made people discuss. So what Immanuel Kant brought to the table through this discussion. Now, Hare was way after Immanuel Kant, so they didn't ever meet. This didn't bring rise to the discussion in Immanuel Kant's mind, but it does to ours. And it brings to light what Immanuel Kant felt about humanity as a whole. There is a principle of humanity that we should all follow, and that people do have rationale. They are autonomous. They deserve dignity and respect, and we should use politeness and consideration when we involve ourselves with other human beings, and that's pretty much our entire life. We need to treat other people not as an end, or rather as an end, but never as a mere means. In other words, don't use people. Don't use them, but treat them as they are the end of whatever you're doing. And that's what he means by treating them as an end, never as a mere means. A means is you're just using them as maybe an ox or as a mule. You're using people as a tool to get what you really want. But he's saying don't do that. You need to show them dignity and respect and treat them with consideration and that sort of thing. That's read these pages of 176 and 177. It explains the way this author does, how we should recognize the principle of humanity. And the importance of this humanity, the principle of humanity, is seen with 7 different points that our author of this textbook, Russ Shafer-Landau, points out. 1, it shows some dignity. It explains the immorality of the fanatical actions. It shows rationale of the dignity of people around you. It helps us understand the importance of autonomy, showing that he uses slavery, and I'll use rape because I think there can never be a time when rape is acceptable. It's treating other humans solely for your own personal gratification. It's using them as a tool. It's not treating them as a means. I mean, it is treating them as a means. It's not treating them as a sole end of life. It's just one of those things. And it also shows this principle of humanity points out the ugliness of paternalism. Remember the term we used a few lessons ago, but it limits the liberty of others, and it takes on the idea, rights and privileges of a parent toward other people. We don't have the right to do that except for with our own children, and then only for a time. Now, we grow up, make our own decisions, and go on. Paternalism is not a good thing. And this Principles of Humanity exposes the wrongness of paternalism. There is a sense of hope that we need to give people, and the Principle of Humanity does that. There's a sense of respect. It engenders respect to people, universal human rights. We're all entitled to the very minimum of respect, and we should always remember that. And there is a sense of accountability that we all must have. Remember, one of the first lessons we had in this class was about autonomy and accepting the accountability of our own actions. We need to accept the ownership of and the responsibility for our own actions, if you remember that. And that's all about accountability. And lastly, it talks about the punishment for misbehavior. And there does seem to be this sense that people do need to be punished, but we don't always need to be, we don't need to carry it out in extreme ways, and we certainly don't need to brainwash people or to torture them. But these are 7 points of importance of the idea of rationality and autonomy that comes through this principle of humanity. Goodwill and moral worth are very important, and Kant suggests that the only thing really that presents itself of real value in our life is called goodwill. And it's made up of 2 parts: ability to reliably know one's own duty, and a steady commitment to doing your duty for its own sake, not out of some emotional thing, not out of some other virtue, but the virtue is of itself is a commitment to do it for itself. And those are the 2 parts for goodwill. Doing something out of the motivation of empathy or compassion or the feel is of no moral worth. The only action, credit, of moral worth is those actions done out of duty. And the 3 parts to this moral duty, I'll just highlight because it is on the quiz, is the structure of action, the nature of reason, and the operation of the will. Problems with the principle of humanity. There are several problems. While I think it sets up well the idea of how we should treat others, the challenges, there's always a counterbalance. And there's an argument for, and then there's an argument against, and then there's an argument for and against, and so on. Well, this is the argument against the principles of humanity. And you can find these on these pages, and I'm going to go through each one. Vagueness. There's a sense of vagueness, determining just deserts, and we'll explain that. We are autonomous. We've gone over that, but we'll hit it again. Moral luck and the scope of the moral community. Who is in and who is out? Vagueness. It's the notion of treating people as an end is vague. What do you mean by that? How does that work? So what are the specifics? How do we precisely know these things? It's difficult to apply this idea, this notion of treating people as an end. You probably already experienced that, trying to figure out what does he mean by treating people as an end. I understand treating them as a means, where they're using other people as a tool, but this is the point of fact. It's a vague idea. Do we respect celebrities by telling the truth about their private lives, even if it's to the ruinness of their reputation? Or are we failing, are we supposed to tell the truth about everything we know? Are we failing to give due respect to famine victims if we spend money on a new computer rather than on donating it to an aid agency? Are we being selfish by living in a house with 9 rooms when there's homeless people on our streets? Doesn't answer these questions. Answers will only come with more precise tests and clarity of what it means to treat others as an end rather than as a means. Determining just deserts. The question here that is being answered is it always appropriate to give people what they deserve? And most of us would say, yeah, it is. But the next question is, what do they really deserve? And how do we know that? There's no clear-cut guide for that. Kant would say yes, people should be treated as they deserve. But what does that mean? there's this term, it's a technical term, I think it's Latin, it's lex talionis. It's the law of retaliation. We treat criminals as they have been, as they have treated their victims, which sounds like it makes sense, right? But does it? There are a few flaws of lex talionis. The flaws of lex. Lex can't explain why criminals who do it intentionally should be punished more than those who accidentally cause such harm. How about the guy that practicing his bow and arrow and accidentally shoots somebody? Kills him on the spot, shoots him through the heart, versus a hired killer that wanted to do it with a bow and arrow. What's the difference? And who's going to make that decision? And how is that decision made? Why do you give one a life sentence or maybe a death sentence, and the other you kind of get them, okay, that was stupid. You did the wrong thing. Realize it. How do we make that decision? That's the flaw. Lex can't tell us what many criminals deserve. I mean, okay, if they did something to other people, if they killed them in a certain way, let's do it that way. But what happens if they didn't intend to do harm, but they did some bad things, like drove drunk? Or what if they were a hijacker or a counterfeiter or taking stolen mattresses across state lines? These are all discussions you'd want to have in class, right? Do we really prescribe the same punishment to the wrongdoers as they did to other people? Sometimes they don't even wrongdo against people. So how do you come up with the proper punishment? Certainly you're not going to rape a rapist or have incest with an incestual person. We can understand maybe burning a building down around someone that liked to burn buildings down around other people, but golly, are we really? Are we going to do these things? It seems like it's a bit much for most of us. So there are some flaws in this law of retaliation. And then for the next flaw of this whole thing of principle of humanity is, are we really autonomous? That's the real question. But are we really? Here's the argument against autonomy on page 187. If you turn there, follow along. Of course, you can read it here. Either our choices are necessitated or they are not. If they are necessitated, then we do not control them. Whoa. And so we lack autonomy because we're forced to, or we're done doing something that's not ours. If they are not necessitated, then they're random, and so we lack autonomy there because randomness is not coming from you. Therefore, we lack autonomy. That's the argument. You may not like the argument. The challenge is found in number 2 and the premise of number 3. These two premises people are challenged by. Number 1 seems right. Either our choices are necessitated or they are not. Either they are by your own choice or they are not. But are they random? Do you do things randomly? To answer the questions, are they autonomous or not, if our choices are all necessitated, then we do not control them, and so we lack autonomy. We lack freedom of choice. If our actions aren't done by a real purpose, then we lack autonomy. The desires, hopes, actions, and fears, beliefs, and so on are all traced back to genes, our personal upbringing, and social influences that are out of our control. Well, maybe we don't have freedom of choice after all. But if the things I have done were not necessary or necessitated by something else, they are my choices, right? If nothing has caused you to choose as you do, then they are completely random. And philosophically, if they're random, they're not necessitated, then this also undermines the freedom of choice, and you have no autonomy. So are you doing it because you're forced to by other things that you're not sure of, or are you just making random choices based on your own randomness? Well, autonomy then is challenged. It doesn't seem right. A lot of philosophers say we are not autonomous. Most non-philosophers say yes, we are. But if number 2 or number 3 are correct, either way, we lack autonomy, and that's a real bummer. But that's going to be an ongoing question. I think most of us think we do have autonomous actions and thoughts. But the next comes with moral luck. Do we have a luck? Are we just lucky? Kant believes that we can only be rightly praised or blamed for what we can control. So hopefully, the argument against autonomy is somehow misguided, he suggests. But maybe shaking a baby or driving through a school zone or over a crosswalk or even doing a race downtown at night, illegally it might be, but if you get caught doing these things, you're punished. But if you're not caught and you win the race, or nothing happens from shaking the baby, or you don't drive over anyone in the school zone, then we're lucky, right? Where is luck drawn? When do we know we have full control? Are we in control when we have luck? And if we are not in control when we have luck, then we're apparently out of control. And do we not have autonomy? Again, maybe. Do we have to be in full control of our action for it to be more we may not have moral worth if it were just about luck. That's what he's suggesting here. And then next comes the scope of a moral community. Who's in, who's out? Our infants, our little babies, are they part of the moral community? Do they make decisions? Are they accountable for their actions? Are the mentally handicapped accountable for all their actions? Should they take full ownership of and responsibility for what they do? And at what point do you draw the line? Do plants? Do animals? Well, then, if they're not part of our moral community, we can just do whatever we want to them, right? Because the principle of humanity would say that those who have rationality and autonomy are in, and those are out. They're not part of this elite group, and therefore we can torture them and we can throw them around and do whatever we want to with them. I think most of us would disagree. But that's the argument. If they're not fully and morally human, then it's okay to torture them. Treat them the way we want, right? I think we are struggling with this one as well. The scope of moral community raises more questions than it helps with our answers to the principle of humanity. But it is one of the challenges. So there's an argument against animals. If the principle of humanity is true, then animals have no rights. And most of us would say, okay, yeah, but there are animal rights. Either you're part of the humanity group or you're not. The concern then, because how can we treat these outside the scope of the moral community? And here's the argument. If the principle of humanity is true, then animals have no rights. If animals have no rights, then it is morally acceptable to torture them. Therefore, if the principle of humanity is true, then it is morally acceptable to torture animals. But it is not morally acceptable to torture animals. Most of us would agree that. It's not right. Therefore, the principle of humanity is false. Well, maybe we don't like that idea either. So sometimes these arguments just create more challenges, but they are thought-provoking, and it should make you think about whether or not animals have rights, and where are the rights of humans drawn? how vague is this principle of humanity? And it has its problems. The principal criticism about Kant overall is that it's too thin of a concept for a moral theory. To do your duty, what's the duty and why are we doing it? Okay, we're making maxims and clarifying them, but in the end, most of us see Kant as unyielding and too rigid. So, but even though a lot of people like a deontology. Compared to utilitarianism, because this is the arena in which he lived, Kant denied that benevolence or any other kind of feeling would be a central moral virtue. Rather, justice and integrity are the key virtues. And you must follow the duty or the maxims, even if doing different will lead to better results. He didn't care about the results. He only cared about following the duty, right? Deontology, doing your duty. Our maxims and free actions are the sole cause of morality, not results or factors outside of one's control. And past actions and just desserts should be emphasized, not on results and not on the future of anything. There are no futures in deontology. There will be in utilitarianism. Moral status is brought by autonomy and rationality, whereas utilitarians, it's just a well-being thing. Moral status is their well-being. Can you feel pleasure or pain? Well, then maybe you're a moral being. But that's Kant is using deontology as an argument against utilitarianism. And a steady commitment to one's duty for its own sake is the only thing worth of moral worth. Not happiness. It doesn't matter about your well-being or the numbers of people that are getting a well-being. Kant was only concerned about the moral worth. And that is done by doing your duty. Kant could see the two duties of people basically as this. He did want to create happiness of other people, and you do that by doing your duty. He also wanted to create your own moral perfection. But the irony of this is that people do just the opposite of these two things. If you think about it for a moment, recognize that most of us spend our life trying to create our own happiness and tell other people how they need to be morally perfect. This is the end of the video. The assignment for this is to summarize, and I just want to remind you, when you're writing your summary, do it in the proper MLA8 formatting and upload into Red Zone in a timely fashion. And that I like longer summaries better than shorter ones. I know, I can tell that you've read the material, you're understanding it, you're processing it, and I want to see that. And so you should have at least a page and a half, and those with more will be likely to get higher marks. So higher points. That's it.